In the context of theism, the word attribute means divine attribute or property of God, a trade-off between logical coherence and religious significance. The divine attribute triangle represents three desired features or desiderata of divine attribute definitions: religiously significant, logically coherent, and independently motivated. On my stock issues chart, let's next move up a level and look at the middle row. I'm going to go through this really fast at first, but don't worry. I will go into detail on each of the boxes on this slide. In the philosophy of religion, it is common to distinguish between theoretical and pragmatic arguments. So-called theoretical arguments attempt to show that God does or does not exist. In contrast, pragmatic arguments attempt to show that theistic or atheistic belief is useful in achieving the agent's goals or objectives. I will categorize theoretical arguments into two types. The first type, which I will call impossibility arguments, attempt to show either that it is impossible for some proposition to be true, or that it is impossible to consistently believe some proposition while performing some action, such as believing the proposition. The second type, which I call improbability arguments, attempts to show that some fact has a negative impact on the probability of a proposition. If that sounds vague right now, it should. There are multiple ways for a fact to have a negative impact on the probability of a proposition, and I will summarize the various ways when I get to that part of the presentation. Admittedly, my way of categorizing theoretical arguments is not standard. To the extent that they categorize theoretical arguments at all, philosophers of religion will usually categorize theoretical arguments as deductive versus inductive, a priori versus a posteriori, or logical versus evidential. So why have I proposed my non-standard terminology? Two reasons. First, I think my labels are more intuitive to non-specialists than the standard labels. Think of the distinction between so-called logical versus evidential arguments from evil. I think that way of talking sounds funny to outsiders. If someone talks about a logical argument from evil, it invites the retort, as opposed to what? An illogical argument from evil? Besides, it applies a distinction to arguments from evil, which are not regularly applied to any other argument about God's existence. For example, philosophers of religion don't routinely differentiate logical moral arguments for theism from evidential moral arguments for theism. My second reason for preferring my non-standard labels is that, while imperfect, I think my labels do a better job than the other labels in emphasizing the degree of uncertainty present in the various arguments. Let me illustrate this by offering two examples. My first example is that sometimes philosophers will present deductive arguments for or against God's existence in a way which gives outsiders the illusion that the conclusion is certain, even though one or more premises in the argument is uncertain. This uncertainty is lost with the standard deductive versus inductive distinction. In contrast to my taxonomy, that uncertainty is highlighted. Such arguments would be categorized as improbability arguments. My second example is that sometimes philosophers will explicitly refer to probability while attempting to demonstrate a logical inconsistency. Using the standard naming convention, such arguments might be categorized as inductive arguments, whereas in my taxonomy they are classified as impossibility arguments. One other introductory comment before we dive into the various argument types or patterns. The goal of this section of the presentation is not to defend a position regarding the success or failure of any specific examples of these argument patterns. Rather, this presentation has two goals. First, to illustrate the argument patterns using real-world examples. Second, to support but not prove the claim that all PoR plus arguments regarding ontology or historicity fit into one of the defined categories. With that caveat out of the way, let's move on. The first type of argument we'll review is the impossibility argument. As the name implies, all impossibility arguments attempt to show a kind of inconsistency. Impossibility arguments are arguments which conclude either that 1, X cannot exist, happen, or be true, or 2, one cannot take some action regarding X, such as believing X, without contradicting a presupposition or entailment of X. All impossibility arguments have two elements. The first element, which I will call essentiality, says that the thing to be shown impossible logically entails or implies some other thing. For example, if you wanted to run an impossibility argument against married bachelors, the essentiality element would be a proposition which stated something like married bachelors entail bachelors. Impossibility arguments can contain multiple essentiality premises. Again, let's consider the example of an impossibility argument against married bachelors. Another essentiality premise would be something like married bachelors entail married persons. The second element of an impossibility argument is the inconsistency premise. Again, using the married bachelor example, the inconsistency premise would say something like, it is impossible for a person to be both married and a bachelor. From the perspective of argumentation theory, answering impossibility arguments is easy. Deny one or both elements of an impossibility argument. First, you could deny that the alleged essential proposition is actually essential. For example, a theist might try to argue that atheism entails materialism. In response, the atheist debater would respond by arguing, no, atheism does not entail materialism. Second, you could deny that the alleged essential proposition is inconsistent with the proposition to be disproved. For example, if an atheist argued that any evil at all, regardless of type, quantity, or distribution, is inconsistent with theism, the theist could argue that evil is consistent with God's existence. Also, third, you could grant the essentiality and inconsistency elements, but insist that is no problem because a true contradiction can exist. That position is called dialetheism, and I am not going to discuss it further in this presentation. There are three types of inconsistencies: internal, external, and performative or pragmatic. I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly, but if you're taking notes, don't worry about keeping up because I will go through each of these in more detail later. The first type, which I will call internal inconsistency arguments, are arguments which attempt to show that some proposition is self-contradictory. You will sometimes hear people describe such propositions as self-refuting. If a proposition is self-refuting, then I would say that there should be a sound internal inconsistency argument against it. The second type, which I will call external inconsistency arguments, are arguments which attempt to show some proposition is logically inconsistent with some other proposition, P2, where P1 does not imply or entail P2. We have independent reasons to think P2 is true, and P1 and P2 are logically inconsistent. The third type, which I call performative or pragmatic inconsistency arguments, are arguments which attempt to show that some action with respect to some proposition is inconsistent with the proposition. You will sometimes hear people call such propositions self-defeating, but that isn't technically accurate. It isn't the proposition which is self-defeating, it is taking some action with respect to the proposition, like asserting, believing, or defending it, which is self-defeating. For example, consider the proposition, it is impossible to know anything. It is logically possible that that proposition is true, but it is logically inconsistent to know that proposition is true. If you somehow knew that it was true, then you would know that it is false. That's an example of a performative or pragmatic inconsistency argument. According to internal inconsistency arguments, the proposition to be disproved is somehow self-contradictory. There are two main types of arguments based on alleged internal inconsistencies. single essentiality disproofs and multiple essentiality disproofs. When the arguments are arguments against theism, they are called single attribute disproofs and multiple attribute disproofs. But what does the word attribute mean? Those divine attributes. The slide lists many, but not all of them. They can be organized in various ways, but in light of the debate between Thomas, or classical theists, on the one hand, and theistic personalists, or neo-theists, on the other, I thought it would be interesting to categorize the divine attributes as personal or impersonal. From the perspective of the average person who has no knowledge of the theological debate between those two camps, I think the words on the left-hand side intuitively sound like things we would say only about persons. We would not say them about things. Some of the attributes on the right-hand side are things which might apply both to persons and things, such as omnipotence and, if you're open to dualism, incorporeality. Other attributes on the right-hand side are things which sound like they apply only to things. Attributes like simplicity, aseity, necessity, and impassibility. I want to emphasize that my criteria for putting an attribute on the left or right side here is simply my prediction of what the average person on the street would think if they were given a definition of each of the attributes. It's not my intention to beg any questions for or against Thomism, and nothing in the rest of this presentation depends in any way on this categorization of the divine attributes. I included this categorization simply to provide one way out of many possible ways to add some structure. I think it makes it easier to understand the divine attributes when they are placed into categories as opposed to just having a long list. There is an interesting link between topicality arguments and internal inconsistency arguments. Recall that in the last video, we saw that when running a topicality argument or objection, a debater can appeal to one or many standards, such as limits, ground, predictability, bright lines, fairness, and education. We also saw that when responding to a topicality argument or objection, the other debater can appeal to counter standards like reasonability, field context, and affirmative predictability. Out of all those standards and counter standards, it seems to me that two are particularly relevant to debating definitions of the divine attributes. First, reasonability seems like a great candidate for a standard. After all, who doesn't want their definition to be reasonable? But this raises an important question. How do you decide what is reasonable? Fortunately, the answer to that is obvious. Lawmakers and lawyers love to use the word reasonable as a hedge word when they want to say something but don't want to be easily pinned down. So defining the word reasonable is a core competency of lawyers. With this in mind, you could hire 3 lawyers, each at a cost of $1,000, and see what they say. You'll be $3,000 poorer, have at least 4 inconsistent opinions, and be no closer to the answer before you started. Just kidding. A more serious answer, but surely not the only serious answer, is to interpret reasonability as religiously significant. On this interpretation, the more a proposed definition aligns with ordinary usage, the more reasonable it is. Second, field context also seems like a great candidate for a standard. Applied to the philosophy of religion, this would mean that the divine attributes should be defined the way that they are defined in the academic literature of theology, especially analytic theology, and the philosophy of religion. Internal inconsistency arguments against different versions of theism are well known and need not be defended solely by atheists. We'll take a look at 2 examples. First, in his book Logic and Theism, the atheist philosopher Jordan Howard Sobel developed a single attribute disproof of essential omnipotence. Second, in his book Does God Have a Nature?, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga argued that the doctrine of divine simplicity is incoherent. If divine simplicity is incoherent, then classical theism, which affirms divine simplicity, is also incoherent. In that sense, you could argue that Plantinga's argument either is, or provides the materials for, a single attribute disproof of classical theism. I could have listed many other single attribute disproofs here, including disproofs of omniscience, omnibenevolence, divine causation, and worthiness of worship. But, as I say, and will say many more times, the goal of this presentation is not to defend these arguments, but simply to illustrate how they fit into my proposed taxonomy. Turning to multiple attribute disproofs, again, I list two examples. Wes Morriston argues that omnipotence is inconsistent with necessary moral perfection, also known as impeccability. And I've sketched an argument for the conclusion that divine aseity is logically inconsistent with an essentially temporal being. But what about internal inconsistency arguments against atheism or naturalism? I'm not sure if there are any such arguments. At first, this might seem not only false, but obviously false. After all, don't ontological arguments at least attempt to establish that God's existence is necessary? Yes, they do, but the type of necessity is not strict logical necessity. In other words, they don't attempt to show that the denial of God's existence entails a logical contradiction. Instead, they attempt to show that God's existence is metaphysically necessary. And yes, I'm fully aware that planting a possibly falling Kripke equates metaphysical necessity with what he calls broad logical necessity. I consider that topic to be a complete tangent or rabbit hole for this presentation, so I'm going to ignore it for now. A more plausible suggestion might be that various transcendental arguments, such as Greg Bahnsen's transcendental argument or Victor Reppert's argument from reason, are internal inconsistency arguments. I disagree. I believe they are better categorized as performative or pragmatic inconsistency arguments, and I will defend that position later on. Yet another idea might be that Joshua Rasmussen's argument in his essay, Does Atheism Entail a Contradiction?, demonstrate an internal inconsistency. Again, I disagree. I believe that argument is better categorized as an external inconsistency, and I hope to defend that position later on. But again, the accuracy of how I categorize various arguments in my taxonomy isn't really the point of this presentation at all. All that matters is that the arguments fit somewhere in my proposed taxonomy of arguments. So if I'm wrong in ontological arguments, Bahnsen's transcendental argument, Reppert's argument from reason, Joshua Rasmussen's T-schema argument, if all of those should be listed on this slide, then so be it. Because all I really care about is whether or not my taxonomy has a home for each of these different argument types. Single attribute disproofs have two stages. In the first stage, they attempt to show that a single attribute or property is self-contradictory. In the second stage, they argue that God is impossible because the self-contradictory attribute is a necessary attribute of God, or perhaps more plausibly, a necessary attribute of some version of God. There is no consensus among philosophers about the logical form of a single attribute disproof. I've given this a lot of thought, and I think for teaching reasons, the schema I display on the slide is the best version. It clearly separates the inconsistency element, which I'm calling stage 1, from the essentiality element, which I'm calling stage 2, which in turn enables critics of such arguments to more clearly identify which part of single attribute disproofs they are rejecting. While critics may sometimes reject single attribute disproofs on multiple grounds, my educated guess is that they typically reject either the inconsistency element, which I'm abbreviating INC, or the essentiality element, which I'm abbreviating as ESS. I am going to spend a disproportionate amount of my time on my first example of a single attribute disproof, Sobel's disproof of omnipotence. Why am I going to spend so much time on Sobel's disproof? Because I want to illustrate with Sobel's argument how quickly definitions of the divine attributes can change and what that means for PoR plus debates. Why am I going to focus on omnipotence? Two reasons. First, Disproofs of omnipotence are arguably the easiest to understand of the various single attribute disproofs. Second, in the opinion of many of the philosophers who have studied internal inconsistency arguments, Sobel's disproof of omnipotence is harder to refute than the other single attribute disproofs. I chose my words carefully. Notice that I said harder to refute. I am not saying that they cannot be refuted or have not been refuted. I am also not saying that they have been refuted, nor am I saying that the other disproofs have or have not been refuted. All I am saying is that many people think Sobel's disproof of omnipotence is more difficult to refute. Before I introduce Sobel's disproof, I first want to look at a related but different disproof, which I'm going to call the disproof of omnipotence 1. It goes like this. Premise 1, an omnipotent one being can do anything. This is the definition of omnipotence which the disproof uses. Premise 2, it is logically impossible to do self-contradictory things. For example, it is logically impossible to draw a square circle or to make 1 plus 1 equal 3. Premise 3, therefore, there are things which are logically impossible for any being to do. Therefore, 4, an omnipotent one being is impossible. And this follows from 1 through 3 by the law of non-contradiction. This argument is clearly valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But are the premises true? No. The problem is premise 1, which is either false or true but theologically irrelevant. Allow me to explain. It is almost universally agreed that the definition of omnipotence is not the ability to do literally anything. Virtually everyone agrees that omnipotence does not include the ability to do the logically impossible. For that reason, most people would say that premise 1 is false. But suppose the defender of this disproof were to dig in their heels and insist that the definition of omnipotence really does include the ability to do literally anything, including the logically impossible. What then? All, or virtually all theists would then shrug their shoulders and say the following. That's not how I define omnipotence, but if you want to insist on that definition, then I will agree with you that an omnipotent being in your sense of omnipotence is impossible. But that fact isn't theologically relevant to me. I do not believe in an omnipotent being in your sense of omnipotent. In other words, you and I agree that it is impossible for there to exist a being which can do literally anything. So what? How about we talk about what I do believe? This can be clearly seen if we add 5 and 6 to create an argument against the existence of omnipotent one God as follows. 5, if God exists, God is omnipotent one. That's the essentiality element. Therefore, 6, God does not exist. And that follows from 4 and 5 by modus tollens. And that also appeals to the law of non-contradiction. So if we add 5 and 6, we then have a valid argument against the existence of God. Notice I said valid, not sound. But most people, including myself, would say that this argument is unsound because premise 5 is false. Most people, and certainly the vast majority of philosophers, do not define God in a way that requires that God be able to do the logically impossible. Thus, most philosophers would agree with stage 1 of the argument, but reject stage 2. They would deny the truth of 5 because they don't believe in an omnipotent one God. Instead, they would define omnipotence in a way that does not require the ability to make a self-contradiction true. Let's take a look at that next. Let's now consider a new definition of omnipotence, which I will call omnipotence 2, the ability to do anything that it is logically possible to do. The definition of omnipotence 2 rules out the need for an omnipotent being to do a logically impossible task, so the previous disproof doesn't work against omnipotence 2. But our sharp-minded philosopher friend says, not so fast. You may have avoided the problem with Omnipotence 1, but that doesn't mean Omnipotence 2 is coherent. In fact, the paradox of the stone shows that Omnipotence 2 doesn't work either. The paradox of the stone can be summed up with a simple question. Can God create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it? The paradox of the stone suggests the following disproof of Omnipotence 2. Premise 1. An omnipotent 2 being can do anything that is logically possible to do. Premise 2. An omnipotent 2 being can either create a stone which it cannot lift, or it cannot create a stone which it cannot lift. Now notice that in premise 2, the action is logically possible. It does not ask us to consider something like squaring a circle or making 2 plus 2 equal 3. Instead, it asks us to consider a logically possible action. Indeed, it asks us to consider an action which is not just logically possible, but possible for humans to do. Humans can make stones we cannot lift. This presents a dilemma. Like all dilemmas, this dilemma has 2 horns. According to the first horn, which I will call the unliftable horn, one possibility is that an omnipotent 2 being can create a stone which it cannot lift. According to the second horn, which I will call the uncreatable horn, the other possibility is an omnipotent 2 being cannot create a stone which it cannot lift. The next 2 premises attempt to show that both horns are a problem. So, premise 3 says, if an omnipotent 2 being can create a stone which it cannot lift, then there is a task which that being cannot perform. Again, the unliftable horn says that there is at least one logically possible task an omnipotent 2 being cannot do. The task is lift the stone. Premise 4, if an omnipotent 2 being cannot create a stone which it cannot lift, then there is a task which that being cannot perform. So here, the uncreatable horn says that there is at least one logically possible task an omnipotent 2 being cannot do. The task of create the stone. Therefore, 5. If there were an omnipotent 2 being, then it would be true that an omnipotent 2 being can do anything that it is logically possible to do, and at the same time it would be false that an omnipotent 2 being can do anything that it is logically possible to do. This intermediate conclusion 5 follows from premises 1 through 4. It says that omnipotence leads to a formal contradiction because both horns of the dilemma in premise 2 lead to the consequence that there is at least one logically possible task which an omnipotent 2 being cannot do. Therefore, 6. An omnipotent 2 being is impossible. This follows from the intermediate conclusion 5 by applying the law of non-contradiction. The disproof of omnipotence 2 is valid, but is it sound? Once again, the key issue is the definition of omnipotence assumed for the disproof, what I'm calling omnipotence 2. There are a few interesting features of omnipotence 2 to point out. First, the combination of omnipotence 1 and omnipotence 2 probably captures the average person on the street's definition of omnipotence. Of course, even if I'm right about that, that point isn't of great philosophical interest. What the average person on the street thinks is not a great way for testing ideas, so I'm not suggesting that the disproof of omnipotence 2, even if successful, is some great or important philosophical accomplishment. Second, notice that the definition of omnipotence 2 says nothing about an omnipotent 2 being as necessarily omnipotent. In other words, omnipotence 2 is logically consistent with an omnipotent 2 being that is necessarily omnipotent, but it is also logically consistent with an omnipotent 2 being that is contingently omnipotent. Third, paradoxically, by itself, the disproof of omnipotence 2 is not a disproof of God's existence. To get a disproof of God's existence, we would need to add a premise to the argument which says that if God exists, God is omnipotent too. This is important because it illustrates the need to separate two questions. Is the disproof sound, and is the definition assumed by the disproof of theological interest? My own view is that the disproof of Omnipotence 2, stage 1, is a sound argument. 6 does follow from 1 through 5. But what about stage 2? What if we add premise 7 so that we have an argument against an omnipotent 2 God? I guess the answer is, it depends. If you were talking to the average person on the street, they might use the Omnipotence 2 definition of omnipotence. If so, the argument is a successful argument against that person's concept of God. But, you knew there was a but coming, I don't think this argument works against the different God concepts adopted by the vast majority of theologians and theistic philosophers. Why? Because they believe that God is necessarily omnipotent. Diminishing one's power is an action that is logically possible for a being that is contingently omnipotent, but it is not a logically possible action for a being that is necessarily omnipotent. For that reason, I feel pretty comfortable predicting that most theologians and theistic philosophers would agree with the disproof of an omnipotent 2 being, and so again, they would agree with stage 1, but they would say the God they believe in is not omnipotent 2, and so they would reject stage 2. We're now in a position to finally look at Jordan Howard Sobel's disproof of omnipotence. The late great atheist philosopher of religion, Jordan Howard Sobel, wrote a book entitled Logic and Theism, Arguments for and Against Beliefs in God, published by Cambridge University Press in 2004. In order to keep this presentation at a reasonable length, I'm going to skip over a bunch of things and introduce his final definition of omnipotence, which I will call Omnipotence 3. Don't get hung up on the number 3, it isn't important. As you can see from the slides, Sobel's final definition of omnipotence is quite technical. So technical that I don't even feel like reading it verbatim. If you want the details, pause the video and read the slide. But the indented paragraph in the smaller font is a verbatim quotation of Sobel's book and includes his own simplification of his definition, and so that is the one I will use going forward. So what is Omnipotence 3? An omnipotent 3 being can do any generally possible universal action, where a universal action is defined as a performance of which does not essentially involve any particular person as its agent, its subject, or in any other way, and is generally possible. With all of that technical formalism out of the way, we can now appreciate Sobel's creative solution to the paradox of the stone. His idea turns on whether omnipotence is an essential attribute of God, or in other words, whether God is necessarily omnipotent or contingently omnipotent. To say that omnipotence is an essential attribute just means that God can't be God without having that attribute. According to Sobel, if omnipotence isn't an essential attribute of a being, then that being can start out as omnipotent and then at a later time diminish its own power, ceasing to be omnipotent. Thus, there is no incoherence in the attribute of Omnipotence 3. But, Sobel argues, this solution isn't available if omnipotence is supposed to be an essential attribute of some being. Thus, Sobel formulates the following argument. Premise 1, necessarily if a being is essentially omnipotent 3, then it can make a stone that it cannot lift. Premise 2, necessarily if a being is essentially omnipotent 3, then it cannot make a stone that it cannot lift. Therefore, 3, necessarily, there is not an essentially omnipotent 3 being. When I discussed this argument on Twitter, I found that many people mistakenly assumed that Sobel was assuming dialetheism. I can't talk today. Dialetheism, the view that there are statements that are both true and false. I don't think that was Sobel's view, but in hindsight, I can see how Sobel's own formulation of his argument might give one that impression. For that reason, I decided to restate Sobel's argument in a way that is consistent with the entire chapter of his book in which the argument appears. Stage 1, we have premise 1. Necessarily, if a being is essentially omnipotent 3, then it is omnipotent 3. Premise 2. Necessarily, if a being is essentially omnipotent 3, then it is incapable of becoming less than omnipotent 3. Premise 3. Necessarily, if a being is omnipotent 3, then it can diminish its own power. Premise 4. Necessarily, if a being is incapable of becoming less than omnipotent 3, then there is no point in time at which that being has diminished power. Therefore, 5. Necessarily, if a being is essentially omnipotent 3, then it is true that it can diminish its own power, and it is false that it can diminish its own power. Therefore, 6. Necessarily, there is not an essentially omnipotent 3 being. Now, stage 1 is Sobel's argument, and then I think we can add on to that what I'm calling stage 2. Premise 7, necessarily, if God exists, God is omnipotent 3. Therefore, 8, necessarily, it is impossible for God to exist. This restatement of Sobel's argument makes explicit what was implicit in his statement of it by calling our attention to two key distinctions. The first distinction is between an essentially omnipotent being versus a non-essentially omnipotent being, or you could say necessarily omnipotent versus contingently omnipotent. The second distinction is between a temporal being, a being that exists in time, and a timeless being. Having debated this argument on Twitter, I've found that the most common objection to the argument is to premise 3. The objection assumes that omnipotence must be an essential attribute, but it is not obvious that if an omnipotent being exists, it must be essentially omnipotent. As Sobel argues, a non-essentially omnipotent being could be omnipotent at T1, diminish its power at T2, and then from T2 onwards no longer be omnipotent. So there's no incoherence in 3, or at least it's not obvious that there is. On the basis of his argument, Sobel then suggests that theists abandon the idea that God is essentially omnipotent. Instead, he says they should think of God as a being with only necessarily self-limited power, or onslip. Since the goal of this part of the presentation is to illustrate a taxonomy of arguments, however, I'm ignoring Sobel's interesting onslip idea. Instead, I'm showing how Sobel's argument, which is stage 1, can be combined with an additional premise to get a single attribute disproof, and that's where stage 2 comes from. So again, the goal of this presentation is to introduce, illustrate, and propose a taxonomy of arguments, not to defend them. But I can't resist the temptation to share the results of some of the research I did while writing this slide. Various theists, including Richard Swinburne, Thomas Morris, Thomas Flint, and Alfred Freddoso, among many others, have worked on developing a coherent version of divine omnipotence in response to the stone paradox. I think Sobel's argument works against the formulations of omnipotence developed by Swinburne and Morris, but I don't have an opinion about the version of omnipotence developed by Flint and Freddoso. Atheist philosopher Eric Wielenberg thinks that their formulation fails, but then, interestingly, he introduces and defends yet another account of omnipotence. So for those members of the audience interested specifically in this argument, or this topic, I would urge them to read Sobel's book and then compare it to Flint and Freddoso's chapter in Freddoso's book entitled The Existence and Nature of God. On the other hand, it seems clear that Sobel's defense of premise 3 in my restated formulation assumes that an omnipotent being necessarily exists in time. But if classical theism is true, God is timeless, and so I don't think that Sobel's argument works against classical theism for that reason alone. I'm sure that classical theists would argue that there are additional reasons why Sobel's argument doesn't work against classical theism, but I'll leave that to them to discuss. Let's move on. Let's now take a quick pause and review the three definitions of omnipotence we've reviewed so far. Omnipotence 1 is the ability to do anything. Omnipotence 2 is the ability to do anything that is logically possible to do. And then Omnipotence 3 says everything that Omnipotence 2 says, but it adds on to it a further restriction and consistent with essential omnipotence. What I want to do now is to show you a slightly different way of presenting that same information. The reason for this should become clear very quickly. The purpose of this slide is to illustrate the progression of definitions of omnipotence. We can think of all definitions of omnipotence as having the following form: a base definition combined with 0 or more restrictions. The simplest definition of omnipotence, Omnipotence 1, just is the base definition with no exceptions. That's what the empty set symbol in the exceptions column means. So the definition of Omnipotence 1 just is the ability to do anything. We can then imagine a counterexample, such as making a round square, which shows that Omnipotence 1 is impossible. In response to counterexample 1, a new definition, Omnipotence 2, is offered. Omnipotence 2 builds on the prior definition by adding one or more exceptions to the set of exceptions included in the prior definition, and in that way avoids the counterexample to the prior definition. Using the table, we read the definition of Omnipotence 2 as the ability to do anything except for any action which is logically impossible. Once again, we can then imagine a counterexample. In this case, the counterexample would be any logically possible action which a contingently omnipotent being can do, such as giving up contingent omnipotence. An essentially omnipotent being cannot diminish its own power, but a contingently omnipotent being can. In response to counterexample 2, once again a new definition, Omnipotence 3, is offered. Omnipotence 3 builds on the definition of Omnipotence 2 by adding a second exception designed to avoid counterexample 2. Using the table, we read the definition of Omnipotence 3 as the ability to do anything except for any action which is logically impossible and any action which is inconsistent with essential omnipotence. Once again, we can then imagine a counterexample. Counterexample 3 would be any logically possible action which an essentially omnipotent 3 being can do, such as preventing the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in the year 2006. I'm going to go through this slide and the next slide very quickly. If you want details, I recommend you pause the video so you can read the slide carefully. In response to counterexample 3, once again a new definition, Omnipotence 4, is offered. Omnipotence 4 builds on the definition of Omnipotence 3 by adding a third exception designed to avoid counterexample 3. Then, once again, we can imagine yet another counterexample, which I will call counterexample 4. We then repeat the same process with Omnipotence 5, but we now leave the territory of single attribute disproofs and move into the territory of multiple attribute disproofs by considering counterexamples which involve conflicts between omnipotence and other divine attributes. Counterexample 5 pits omnipotence against moral goodness or moral perfection. It also pits omnipotence against being an immaterial being. Finally, we arrive at Omnipotence 6. Omnipotence 6 solves for counterexample 5, but has the ironic result of making an omnipotent 6 being less powerful than an omnipotent 5 being. Hopefully, these 6 versions of omnipotence are enough to illustrate the point. You have some version of omnipotence, some pesky philosopher identifies a counterexample, and then some other philosopher adds an exception to the set of exceptions in order to avoid that counterexample. This kind of an arms race approach to defining omnipotence has led philosopher Wes Morriston to wonder if philosophical theologians are winning individual battles while losing the war. He wrote, In recent years, definitions of omnipotence have become more and more complicated. Indeed, they frequently employ so much technical apparatus and contain so many subordinate clauses and qualifications that it is natural to wonder whether they have much to do with what an ordinary person might mean by saying that God is all-powerful. I am confident that Morriston's comment about the increasingly complicated definitions of omnipotence applies equally to the definitions of omniscience. I suspect that it probably generalizes to the definitions of many, if not most, of the other divine attributes. His comment suggests a trade-off between logical coherence and religious significance. The more coherent the definition, the less it has to do with what the average person means by the word, and vice versa. This makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, but I'm not sure what, if any, philosophical conclusions follow from this. Suppose that each of the divine attributes, not just omnipotence, can be defined in such a way that each of them avoids self-contradiction. But the definitions are so complicated that they have very little to do with what the average person thinks. In that hypothetical situation, would it follow that the definitions are wrong? No, of course not. If our knowledge of quantum physics is even partially accurate, we already know that quantum reality is complex and weird. It may be the case that theological reality, if there is such a thing, is complex and weird too. But nevertheless, an ideal definition of a divine attribute should be not only logically coherent and religiously significant, it should also be independently motivated, in the sense that we should have some other reason for expanding the set of exceptions in addition to a desire to avoid a disproof. The divine attribute triangle represents three desired features or desiderata of divine attribute definitions: religiously significant, logically coherent, and independently motivated. If it is impossible for a definition to satisfy all three desiderata, then theists might have a problem on their hands. They would have an inconsistent triad, and so could pick at most only two features. Again, the purpose of this presentation is not to take a side, or even to provide a comprehensive overview of the debate concerning single divine attributes, but rather to give you a feel for how such arguments work, and more to the point, the kind of issues which would be relevant in a formal PoR plus debate involving single attribute disproofs. I'm now going to go through some other examples of internal inconsistency arguments, but I'm going to do so much more quickly. I now want to consider a very different kind of single attribute disproof. I'm only going to devote a single slide to it, though. The doctrine of divine simplicity, or DDS, is a theological doctrine which says God is ontologically simple. In this context, God is ontologically simple means God is partless, which in turn means God lacks spatial, temporal, or metaphysical parts. But what does that mean? Well, according to proponents of the doctrine of divine simplicity, metaphysical distinctions such as matter versus form, potency versus act, and existence versus essence do not apply to God. Furthermore, there is no distinction between God and God's attributes like his omnipotence, his omniscience, and so forth. Rather, God is identical to his properties, which means God is his omnipotence, which is his omniscience, and so forth. If that sounds confusing to you, you're not alone. In his 1980 book, Does God Have a Nature?, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga argued that the doctrine of divine simplicity is incoherent. What he wrote in that book may be summarized in the following disproof. Premise 1, if God is ontologically simple, then God is identical to his properties. Premise 2, if God is ontologically simple, then God is alive, knowledgeable, capable of action, powerful, and good. 3, if God is identical to his properties, then God is a property. 4, if God is alive, knowledgeable, capable of action, powerful, and good, then God is not a property. Therefore, 5, if God is ontologically simple, it is true that God is a property, and it is false that God is a property. Therefore, 6, it is impossible for God to be ontologically simple. What Plantinga wrote is essentially stage one of a single attribute disproof argument against God, or more specifically, the God of Thomism or so-called classical theism. We get the full argument by adding on stage two, and that goes like this. Premise 7. If Thomistic theism is true, then God is necessarily ontologically simple. Therefore, 8. It is impossible for Thomistic theism to be true. To avoid any misunderstandings, I want to point out that I am not endorsing or anti-endorsing his argument. Thomas have a ready reply to this argument. Their reply would be that Plantinga is making metaphysical assumptions directly at odds with the metaphysics of Thomism. So, they would say, he is tearing down a straw man of his own creation. Again, my goal here is neither to defend nor criticize this argument, but merely to illustrate an example of an argument from an internal inconsistency, as well as give a quick preview of how a debate about this argument would likely go. So much for single attribute disproofs. Let's now move on to the other type of internal inconsistency argument, which is known as multiple attributes disproofs. On the slide, I show a generic multiple attributes disproof argument against theism. Premise 1, if God existed, then God would have property P1. Notice that's the element of essentiality, but because we've got multiple attributes, I now identify it as attribute 1. Premise 2, if God existed, then God would have property P2. Again, that's the essentiality element of the internal inconsistency argument applied to attribute 2. Premise 3, if God had property P1, then some consequence C follows. 4, if God had property P2, then not C. Therefore, 5, it is impossible for God to have both P1 and P2, or I guess is the way I reworded on the slide. If God existed, it would be true that's C, and it would be false that's C. And therefore, 6, it is impossible for God to exist. The first multiple attributes disproof I want to consider comes from philosopher Wes Morriston. Until fairly recently, Wes was a Christian. I'm not sure how he categorized himself in 2001. Anyway, Dr. Morriston uses the letter E to represent some state of affairs that is so bad that it is hard to believe that there is any possible situation in which God, or anyone else for that matter, would be morally justified in actualizing it. Perhaps an innocent child's being maliciously tortured is a sufficiently uncontroversial example, he writes. With that definition of E in mind, his argument may be restated in my format as follows. Premise 1, if God existed, then God would be necessarily morally perfect. Premise 2, if God existed, then God would be omnipotent. 3, if God is necessarily morally perfect, then there is no possible world in which he actualizes E. 4, if God is omnipotent, then there is a possible world in which God actualizes E. 5, therefore, if God existed, it would be true that there is a possible world in which God actualizes E, and it would be false that there is a possible world in which God actualizes E. Therefore, 6, it is impossible for God to exist. The second multiple attributes disproof I wish to consider is my own, an argument I call the Aseity versus temporal argument, an impossibility argument against a version of theism I call temporal theism. What is temporal theism? I define temporal theism as theism conjoined with the proposition God is necessarily temporal, or in other words, God is necessarily in time. The argument goes like this. Premise 1, if temporal theism is true, then God is ase. Premise 2, if temporal theism is true, then God is temporal. 3, if God is ase, then God is self-existent, independent, and underived. Premise 4, if God is essentially temporal, then God is dependent on time. Therefore, 5, if temporal theism is true, it is true that God is independent of time, and it is false that God is independent of time. Therefore, 6, it is impossible for temporal theism to be true. I want to conclude this very brief overview of internal inconsistency arguments with 3 observations. First of all, the examples we just reviewed assumed that classical logic, and in particular the law of non-contradiction, is valid. But one option that is always available, not just when responding to an internal inconsistency argument, but to any argument, is to simply deny classical logic. While doing research for this part of the presentation, I ran across an article by 2 professional philosophers published in a professional journal of philosophy which defended the coherence of essential omnipotence by denying the law of non-contradiction. I then discovered no less than 3 books published by Oxford and Cambridge University presses which also take the route of denying classical logic. I haven't studied paraconsistent logic, so I'm afraid I don't have much to say about that. If that is the price someone wants to pay in order to hold on to their belief in God, then they can pay that price and have that belief. Second, as we saw in the case of Sobel's argument against essential omnipotence, debaters should understand the distinction between essential and inessential attributes of God. If you think of God as having properties, inessential attributes are properties God doesn't need to be God. Sobel thought he had a good argument against essential omnipotence, but he didn't think omnipotence was an essential attribute of God, which is why he didn't present the argument as an argument against God's existence. You'll remember I had to add an additional premise to illustrate an internal inconsistency argument. Here's another example. Consider any definition of God which includes the idea that God is the creator of the universe. According to such definitions, one of God's attributes is the attribute of being the creator of the universe. Most, but not all theists, however, have typically believed that God freely chose to create the universe. On this definition, God could have created angels, but no universe. Or God could have created absolutely nothing at all and just basked in his own glory for eternity. Because of examples like these theists would say that the attribute, being the creator of the universe, is not an essential attribute of God. Thus, when considering internal inconsistency arguments against theism, you need to take a careful look at whether the divine attribute or attributes mentioned in the argument are essential or inessential attributes of God. To make things further complicated, you need to consider that classical theism or Thomism thinks about God's attributes very differently. As we saw when looking at Plantinga's argument, Thomists say that God is identical to his attributes, and each of his attributes are identical with one another. So these arguments can be a lot more complicated than they might appear. Third, another option for responding to internal inconsistency arguments is what I call theory revision. In this option, one grants that the argument is sound and then redefines the essential attribute in order to avoid the argument. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here because I do not want to be misunderstood. What I am calling theory revision might remind some people of Antony Flou's famous parable of the invisible gardener. My own opinion is that some cases of theory revision are legitimate, and then in other cases, theory revision is ad hoc. How do you tell the difference? I don't know. I don't know if anyone has worked out a good mechanical way of sorting out legitimate versus ad hoc theory revisions in the context of defining a word. So what we're really talking about is legitimate versus ad hoc redefinitions. But from both a formal debating perspective and a PoR plus perspective, I think a crucial question is whether the revised theory, in other words, the redefined divine attribute, can be independently motivated or if it is purely an ad hoc move to avoid the conclusion. For these 3 reasons, I would say that there are successful internal inconsistency arguments against specific interpretations or definitions of divine attributes, but it would be risky for debaters to rely solely upon such arguments. Why is it risky? because it is far from obvious that all significant versions of philosophically interesting positions are vulnerable to such arguments. And by the way, the word debaters here does not just mean atheists. It applies equally to theistic debaters who debate one another, such as a Muslim debater using only an argument for the incoherence of the incarnation or the Trinity against the Christian, or someone like, say, Alvin Plantinga using only an argument for the incoherence of divine simplicity in a debate against a Thomist. For my part, as an atheist, I've always operated on the assumption that people can endlessly redefine or jettison attributes as needed to avoid arguments, so it is more productive to focus on investigating whether there are any good improbability arguments instead. If you've enjoyed this review and you're not already a subscriber to my channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button. You'll get notified when I upload new videos. Also check me out on Twitter and on Blogger.